You ask, make sure that you ask a POI loud enough for the speaker to hear, okay? And I will try to clap on a minute, but sometimes the audio doesn't pick that up. So make sure that you're kind of looking at your own clock or timer so that we know when the first minute is up. Okay, remember, no POI is the last minute. And so I'd like to call the first speaker of the proposition team to come up and open up her team case. Whenever you're ready, Isha.
Okay. This House would require the victim's consent prior to prosecuting cases of domestic violence. There is a problem when we don't have the victim's consent. Doing so would be completely turning a blind eye to the possibilities of how the victim would like to handle the case. It would prevent consideration of the victim's privacy and personal matters. Ops world does not give people the autonomy to decide for themselves. The burden is to prove that we can provide a better future for the victim. This looks like helping the victim heal from traumatic experiences and then setting them up to continue with a life that is better than the one they were in before. In order to do so, we need to listen to the victim and ask them what they would like to happen. This looks like asking them for permission to prosecute the case. Consent is seeking permission for something to happen without coercion. In this case, it would be the victim agreeing to prosecution of the abuser. So in our world, if the victim does not want to pursue legal recourse, the case cannot be taken to court no matter what. It is also important to talk about the extent of domestic violence. Domestic violence comes in many forms: physical, verbal, and emotional abuse. It is best understood under law in terms of intimate partnerships, and therefore this debate does not involve children, because one, children are not intimate partners, and two, children legally cannot give consent. So what does this look like? It looks like a wife slapping her husband across the face. It looks like the police being called to the condo of a same-sex couple after hours of arguing and yelling. It looks like a husband of 10 years of marriage losing his temper and shoving his wife up against the wall for the very first time. Our policy is that we would detain the abuser to remove possible duress and then give the victims a substantial amount of time to decide whether they will prosecute. We would also give the victim basic needs and shelter. People who are affected by domestic violence include the victim, family members, and the abuser. But we need to focus on the victim as they are the ones that are most impacted. Therefore, it is extremely crucial to do something that not many people have been doing to them, which is listen. The thesis of my first point is
Point of
that...
information, ma'am.
Sure.
Will you thus require the permission of all victims when being prosecuted for all crimes, for any crime?
We would require their consent for any form of domestic violence that they report in order to prosecute the case. The thesis of my first point is that victims have rights. They should give their consent prior to prosecuting cases, as victims have the right to privacy, dignity, and choice. So why is having these three rights important? Well, first of all, the victim is the one who has been through the experience and has been harmed. They should, no matter what, have the right to choose whether to take legal action against the abuser. Our policy would also protect their privacy. It is normal for a victim to not want to prosecute with the thought that others would look down on them. So what does having the right to these three principles look like? The victim knows themselves and the situation best, as they and the abuser were the only people involved in the incident. Therefore, the victim is the only person that we can trust. We need to show that we trust them back by giving them time to think and really analyze what happened during the abuse. Giving them the right to choice would be showing that we care more about the healing of the victim rather than taking justice. Letting the victim stand up on their own terms would also pose an example for other women to gain the confidence to step up. What would it look like if we didn't give them the right to choose to prosecute? This would be ignoring the possibilities of what happened during the abuse. It would not only not consider whether the abuse was just a one-time thing, but it would also completely ignore the possible repercussions that prosecuting can have on the victim. They have just gone through abuse and now you want to force them to take legal action. The state would be forcing the victim to relive the abuse, and while safety is important, it should not be at the expense of a victim's mental health. Let's say that we did not require consent and a victim who has been sexually abused is forced to prosecute. Not only might she feel embarrassed, but she would also have to relive the traumatic experience instead of recovering. The victim should have rights, as she wants privacy more than she wants the prosecution. The government should protect her rights as a victim to choose between the two. However, when the state issues a zero tolerance policy, it allows for no flexibility and benefits for the victim. In the 10-year marriage example, the zero tolerance policy would be dooming the relationship, even though it was just a one-time thing. Also, victims don't want to relive the experience, they just want the abuse to stop. The thesis of my second point is that when victims have a choice on whether to pursue prosecution, this not only re-empowers them, but also offers them benefits. So what are these benefits? By giving the victim the right to choose, we would be putting them in a better situation by giving them psychological and emotional benefits. Not prosecuting would let the victim focus on healing, which is more important than taking legal action. The victim can end up in a better situation if she
Point
does.
of information.
No, thank you. Prosecution does not have to be required in a one-time situation, but only the victim knows whether it's one time or not, meaning that we have to hear what the victim has to say. So what are the negative impacts of prosecuting without consent? Let's say that we took legal action without the victim's consent. If the abuser lost the case, the victim can actually end up in a worse situation before. This is because in ops worlds, after the prosecution, they would be left to fend for themselves, especially if they were dependent on the significant other. There would be so much that they had before that they now do not have. On the other side, there's the possibility of the abuser winning the case. This would put the victim in a psychologically bad state, knowing that the abuser is still out there and possibly wants to attack them again. If we had the victim's consent, they would be confident that the abuser is in the wrong and that justice can be served. Not having the victim's consent would be putting them in a place where multiple things can go wrong, almost all of which would end up harming them again. And for these reasons, I am proud to propose.
Okay, thank you. Speaker spoke for 5 minutes and 56 seconds. Okay, thank you for your speech. Okay, I'd like to call the first speaker of the opposition to come up and deliver his team's case. Let me set my timer. Okay. Who's the speaker? Raise your hand, please. Okay. All right, whenever you're ready. Okay, make sure you unmute.
Yep.
Okay.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Side proposition wants these people to heal. They want them to be able to not relieve this trauma again. Yet they want to give victims the ability to put themselves back into a relationship with their offenders. They want to give the victims a chance to go back and get abused by them. We don't see how this works, and this is also very problematic. And furthermore, victims will also not want to engage in this like kind of relationship again with them because of how violent it is, of how problematic it is. And we also see that this cannot work if they want for healing on their side. We cannot allow them to interact again with them, and we also cannot allow them to get into another relationship. And they also told us that many of these times, these kinds of incidents are one time off only. It's just I hit you, I slap you once, and then I go to the police station and report it. No, this is not how it works in the real world. In the real world, what happens is that people are abused in the private sphere. You say that, oh, if you report me, and a lot of abusers coerce their victims and say that, oh, if you report me, I will kill you, I will harm you in a very like sadistic ways. And we see that this is this is an emotional tool that a lot of these victims, a lot of these abusers tend to use on their victims. And this is not something, and especially since this happens in a private sphere, there often isn't a third party to go and report these cases. And we see that this oftentimes recurs over a very long period of time, over a few years, and possibly even for the rest of their lives. So we see that this is not something that is realistic on side proposition. and we see that their case does not stand. And now, what is our policy? So our policy is that we are going to give these abusers rehab, and we see that we don't want them to come back after detention to come and assault these victims. We don't want them to come back and inflict any more pain on these victims. And through this rehab, our side is able to better give these victims abilities to rehabilitate and heal. And now on to our first substantive. So we see that we cannot let these victims make the decision because of how they're unable to make this decision, as I proved to you in my first substantive. So we see that these people are oftentimes, since this abuse and trauma happens over such long periods of time, they become incapable of making any more rational decisions due to the emotional trauma they face, right? For 365 days every year, 24/7, you come back to your home and you see your partner sitting at the table with a belt in his hand, and this emotional trauma of abuse happening over and over again normalizes this emotional pain for the victim, and then after that he becomes very and this pain and this emotional trauma becomes very ingrained into these victims. And what happens when this is the case? They see that these victims are no longer able to make rational decisions because of the mental state, right? They are unable to anymore. They are unable to make rational decisions because of how the psychological trauma is influencing them, and therefore they cannot properly make a decision as to whether prosecution should be allowed. And we see that this is problematic because abusers cannot get the punishment that they deserve, and the justice system doesn't work anymore. Secondly, we see that it sends out this is a strong deterrence for future domestic crimes, because when site proposition allows for these victims to make decisions as to whether they should prosecute the others. This is not a strong message that is sent by the law, by the justice system. You're saying that you're giving a choice to whether you can be prosecuted of a crime, and this is not how the justice system works. If you commit a crime, that is a crime, and if you beat your wife, that is a beating in itself, and no excuses should be given. We don't want people to think that like domestic violence is a normalized situation, and we don't see that this is good, and we don't see that how this is good. So when we do see that people are when we do allow for deterrences, we protect society as a whole, because we don't want we protect society because we don't want them we don't want more incidences of domestic violence happening. On site proposition, what happens is that they're able to they're encouraging domestic violence, they're encouraging cases of domestic violence, and we see that the harm that they do to society is much greater, and we cannot allow the decision and autonomy to fall in the hands of victims. And for all these reasons and more, I'm so proud to oppose.
Okay, speaker spoke for 5 minutes and 58 seconds. Okay. Who's the second speaker? Okay. Kyra, are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to invite the second speaker of the proposition to come up and continue her team's case whenever you're ready.
Now, before I begin my speech, I would like to recharacterize this debate slightly. Like my first speaker stated, we are taking domestic violence as incidents that have occurred over time and in extremes, such as a husband beating his wife repeatedly, like side proposition said, but we're also taking into consideration the smaller one-offs that occur between couples who naturally fight. People who live together for a long period of time will obviously have disagreements. Like an accidental push against a wall or a action taken during a spur of a moment argument is also considered domestic abuse, but we should, in our world, consider domestic abuse. And I would also like to restate how in our world, because of our policy, we are urging victims we're trying to give a better future to the victims. We're trying to give them the right to have the future that they want and the right to have a better life than the one that they had before. Again, I would like to restate you will not involve this debate because it's between intimate partners. And we would also, and our policy is again focusing on how to give victims a breathing space when their reporting occurs, so that they're able to make the decision that OPS says they cannot. Now, on to rebuttals. OPS stated that in their world, women have gone through so much emotional trauma. They've gone through so many years of abuse and have been coerced into thinking a certain way that they cannot make the correct decisions needed. But in our world, that won't happen. It's because of our policy. We are going to give victims a substantial amount of time after the reporting has occurred, which will allow them to think through and properly address the situation. Again, we would like to restate how domestic violence is different from normal crimes. In their POI, they asked us if we would like prosecute we would prosecute for all other crimes without consent. But domestic violence is different. It is between the abuser and the victim. It's not affecting society as a whole. It's a very intimate crime that occurs within a home. Now, because of this, it requires the victim's consent to be prosecuted. That is the nature of the crime, and because of that, it's different. And that is why we definitely need the consent of the victim to further prosecute this. And in our world, we give them the ability to properly make that decision to give them a better life and a better future ahead. Now moving on to my substantive. The thesis of this argument is that in our world, we could incentivize people to reach out more and report and increase the number of reports of the cases that are occurring. Now, this is because there is a reason why victims do not want to report a case. It's either because, like my first speaker stated, it's to do with the emotional trauma they might further face because of a trial, or the fact that they just want to move on from that aspect of their life and live a better life ahead. There are many reasons, and we cannot know this. The authorities do not know the victim's life, again, because domestic violence is a very intimate crime and it needs to be dealt as such. And in our world, by giving the policy that we have, which is the substantial amount of time for women to be able to decide, or victims to be able to decide what they want to do, what the next step shall be, they know that they will have the ability to control their future. They will be able to have the future that they want. This will just incentivize them to report the crime more and have a higher number of cases reported, domestic violence, that can be
Point of information.
I'll take in a moment. That can be considered by the authorities later. Thereby, we allow more cases to be reported and less time spent by the police on cases and prosecutions that could take up the time for more important and pressing matters. Yes?
So if your side believes that these people can choose not to prosecute their abusers, for example, then do you think that they should be going back to the same life in which they were constantly abused by them?
Our side is in no way saying that we want the victim to go back to the life that they had before. We're saying that we want them to choose what they want, where we can offer them whatever shelter we need. We can offer them we can offer them the steps that they want to take next in their life. And they get to decide that, which is what we stand for. To summarize, our side stands for the victims having the right to their privacy, which is to avoid their personal life being aired out in a trial, and to give them the ability to properly understand what they want for the future and not be affected by the coercion that they were suffering for those years. That's why I'm proud to propose.
Okay, thank you. All right, speaker spoke for 5 minutes and 33 seconds. Okay, we thank her for her speech. Okay, is the next speaker for Raffles ready? Who would that be? Raise your hand, please. Okay. All right, whenever you're ready. You want to do a mic test real quick?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes, very clearly. Okay.
All right. Thank you. Let me just set my timer. All right. Before I move on to my rebuttals for today, two main points to bring up. First, on the point of information that was raised on the first speaker, we asked them whether they would want to allow the victim consent in any and every crime, and they said yes, they would. We believe that this is especially harmful in cases, for example, in rape, where the victim may not be able to make an informed decision, and we believe that this is where their sex sets a bad precedent, because when they allow the victim to be able to choose and decide on what they want to do, there is a high chance, and we have already shown why in our first substantive, for the victim to actually make wrong and irrational decisions. And that is why our side believes that it is the victim should not be given the consent to prosecute in this case. Now, on the second point, that side did not deal with our second substantive on why we would have a strong deterrence by prosecuting these victims and by not giving the victims, by prosecuting these abusers. We have already shown you in our second substantive that it's precisely because these abusers are being prosecuted, we are sending a strong message to society that we do not condone domestic violence, that we do not condone these people from continually abusing their victims and continuing to go unnoticed. Their side needs to deal with their substantive, or if not, they have already lost the debate. Because even if these victims can have these rights that they talk about, if we also believe that the state still has a greater importance in keeping this deterrence strong for other families and for other people in society.
POI, sir.
Hold on for a moment. Two main clashes for today. First, on whether victims are coming out and having consent is a good choice. And second, on where should the consent lie. But before I move on, yes.
Why do you believe a rape victim who has been raped by someone will make the decision to not persecute?
We believe that there are many reasons as to why a victim may not choose to actually prosecute. For example, the emotional trauma that they have felt, perhaps not in a rape case, but in a case of domestic violence, it may be the fear of being exposed, maybe the fear of being further bullied or further abused by the abuser, and perhaps the fear of in the future, like what Des said, the trauma of the society around them actually condemning them. We believe that these are things that would ultimately could lead to the victim not making a choice that would benefit them in the future. And that is why our side believes that the state should be the one making this decision. And now first on our first class on whether victims coming out is a good choice. What did side proposition tell us? Side proposition told us that authorities who do not know the life of the victim, and since the victim know themselves best, it is best for them to be the ones who have the right and the choice to choose whether to give consent. We believe that this is firstly not true because many a times, right, these victims who have suffered from emotional trauma, they are not the ones making decisions rationally. As I've shown you in my first substantive, these victims are possibly those who have emotional trauma, and they are people who are not able to make rational decisions because of this, or even the fear of being further abused. But not only that, we believe that even if these victims see rationally, they may only be able to see the short term. They may not be able to understand the long-term consequences of being abused, and they may just think that it is fine, I'll just endure with this, and that is why this is especially harmful, right? But furthermore, we believe that it is the state's duty, and this is where the second clash comes in. We believe it is the state's duty to actually have the consent over the victim and on whether we should prosecute these crimes. Because firstly, it is the state's duty to provide a strong deterrence against domestic violence. We do not believe that even if the victim has a rational decision to make, this rational decision should be made by the victims, because even if the victim has a completely good reason for example, not wanting this case to continue, we believe that it is still in the interest of the general public and in the interest of deterrence that we keep this prosecution going. And that actually leads quite well to my third substantive on why there's a social contract for the state from the state to the citizens. We believe that the premise of this substantive is that there is a social contract present between the state and the citizens. What does this mean? This means that the state has a duty to protect you and to support you and to ensure your well-being. And why does the state therefore have the final call for whether your abuser should be prosecuted in domestic violence cases? We believe that the state needs to be able to make the decision of whether to prosecute, not only because of deterrence, but because even if the victim makes a rational decision, we believe that it's in the end still ultimately bad for the victim. If the victim still is going to allow the abusers to get away with this crime, we believe that this is going to be ultimately bad for the victim, the family of the victim. We believe it's not going to be in the favor of the victim, because even if they think they have the right to, for example, lead the lives that they want to choose, but we believe that this choice that they're going to make is going to harm them in the long run further. We parallel this to things such as seatbelts, right? Where where the state makes an active choice and tells people to, for example, mandate wearing seatbelts. And for all these reasons and more, we believe that the state should be the one making this consent, not the victim. Side with opposition.
Okay, thank you. Speaker spoke for 6 minutes and 11 seconds. Okay, so listen, we're definitely gonna have time for replies. So make sure that whoever your reply speaker is, that they're gonna be ready, okay? So 3-minute replies. Okay. Let's see, Guav, are you ready? Okay, so all right, whenever you're ready.
Okay, I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. So, what is the main concept that side opposition has missed throughout this debate? The main concept that side opposition has missed throughout this debate is, why would you prosecute if it provides no substantial benefit to the victim? Now I'd like to start off with a speech summary for the adjudicator. I will first start off with some clarifications, next move on into rebuttals, and finally end off with clashes. For my clarifications, I would like to say that firstly, they're characterizing the victim as a mindless individual. They keep on characterizing the victim as unable to make decisions because of trauma or other factors, but they really provided no evidence as to why this was true, and I'll move on to this later on in my rebuttals. Secondly, they also characterized this debate as in a situation in which no victims were going to prosecute. For example, they kept on talking about how this would be a bad image for the public. This would not look good for the public if no people are prosecuting, but this is simply not the case. In the very rare circumstances where it's necessary for someone to not prosecute because of the benefits it brings for them, I don't see why this one case should have such a big impact in their world if they're talking about the general view of domestic violence in general. Next, I'd like to move on to rebuttals. And I'd first like to start off with their substantive about trauma, as I talked about before. So firstly, they provided no analysis as to why this trauma would result in people making worse decisions. And I encourage them to provide this analysis. But what I'd like to say is that for someone who has been raped or who's gone through domestic abuse, they would only not make the decision to prosecute in a situation in which they've weighed up their situation very carefully. I do not see why they would treat this as a throwaway decision. This is a decision that could change their life, and they would need to take this decision extremely seriously. And even if we take their substantive to be true, that trauma would hinder their ability to make a decision, we have still provided a policy in which we give the victim a set amount of days in which they can think about the decision. They can make the right decision. They can think about the consequences it means for them. And as a result, we set the victim up in the best possible way to make this decision for themselves. Now, next, I'd like to go into their two classes that they provided to us. Firstly, about whether or not victims having consent is good or bad. They talked about a short-term versus long-term way up. Yet they provided no evidence as to why abuse would be a sort of long-term thing which they could not physically see. They characterize short-term benefits as things such as, I want to be with my partner in the short term, and abuse is something which is a long-term thing which has a long-term effect. However, in their characterization of the entire world, this abuse is something that is taking a toll on them and is something that they're willing to go and prosecute for. And so finally, I'd like to move into my clashes for this debate. The first being what the main stakeholder is. Now, in the second speaker's speech, they came up and talked about where consent should lie. They talk about the state's duty in protecting the interests of public and a social contract. And I'd like to rebut both of these points. Firstly, they talked about the interest of public. It kind of really boggles me how their side thinks that the interest of the public is the main stakeholder in this debate. In this debate, the main stakeholder is the victim. The victim is the one that's going through this abuse. The victim is the one that's handling the situation, and yet they're here talking to us about the right of the rest of the public. Furthermore, they're talking about a social contract. They said the social contract is the duty of a state to protect its citizens. And however, I think that this is a skewed definition of a social contract. Social contract, by definition, is the way up between the duty of a state to provide security to its citizens and the rights of these citizens. And the rights of these citizens in this situation, in a situation where, as we have stated throughout our speeches, is so intimate to the victim and the abuser, should have greater rights provided to the victim, because they are the ones that are in the center of this, not the state. So next, I'd like to move on by talking about the spectrum of cases that the main stakeholder can come in. And so the victim can be abused in different situations, from one-offs to extremely serious cases. Now, why is our situation better for the one-offs? We see that in their world, if somebody reports and is immediately prosecuted, no one is going to want to report a one-off. In our world, we promote people speaking up about domestic abuse. We promote people reporting domestic abuse, and we promote people taking decisions and taking action on domestic abuse. And this is to make the state aware that they have experienced this domestic abuse, even if it's a one-off, and if they don't want to prosecute, if it happens more in the future, they will have a greater confidence to prosecute and go forward, and which is why we are better for these one-off cases. Now about the serious cases, which is what they have been talking about this entire time. They keep on stating how in these serious cases, it is necessary for the state to take action because they cannot make decisions for themselves. However, we think that even in these serious cases, it is better on our side. They have said that in serious cases, people will not want to prosecute because of things such as retribution. However, we say that if the person makes the decision to prosecute, where is the retribution going to come? If the person is in jail, no retribution can come. And furthermore, we think that if the person decides not to prosecute, it is obviously for a good reason. Because we have told you how there is no trauma that interferes in the decision, because we have told you how we allow the person to make the best decision, we've told you how they are making the best decision for themselves and making the best decision for the rest of their life. And they should have the right to this decision, as we've talked about throughout this debate and how they have not given a rebuttal to. So overall, we win this debate because we tackle the rights for the main stakeholder, the victim. We make sure the main stakeholder, the victim, not only has greater rights, but also greater benefits. And we tackle this on a spectrum of cases from both the one-offs all the way to the serious cases, whereas they only tackle the serious cases and not very well as well. Thank you. And because of this, I am so proud to propose.
Okay, speaker spoke for 6 minutes and 20 seconds. Okay, so remember, proposition reply, speaker goes last. Okay. Is third up, ready?
Yeah. Are you guys able to hear me?
Yes, we are. So whenever
Okay,
you're
thank
ready,
you.
okay?
Okay.
Okay.
So the main crux of the entire debate was about whether the victim is able to make the correct choice in determining whether they should prosecute the abuser. So now, what side proposition essentially came out and told us that they are able to very rationally weigh things and think about where do they want their life to go, and they know the family dynamic and the relationship dynamic better than anyone. However, we see for a few reasons this is not the case. So we see, first of all, they make an assumption that every victim can think rationally and make a good choice. So we see that this is not true. You see that if you are someone who have been repeatedly abused, and you can't expect them to have a very rational, clear thought process when all they can think about is about how every day they're getting beaten or like heard vulgarities at, and we don't see how they can make the right choice. Now, even if you assume that they're somehow very clear-headed after months and years of abuse, now we see that even if they make a rational decision, it's still not a good one. So we see that essentially a rational decision can come in two forms. Number one, they may prioritize the short-term gains and thus decide not to prosecute. Now this is because they may see that, oh, if I decide to prosecute, now if the prosecution doesn't pan out, then in that case, oh, it's even worse for me because I'll receive retribution and there'll be even more violence done to me. Now we see that this, yes, is a completely rational decision. However, it is still a bad one and will ultimately be even worse in the long term because it will allow it will sort of imply to the abuser that they are okay with the abuse and they will just continue with the abuse. So we see that, and even if and however, they also said that, so we see that as I've proven that the victim cannot make the appropriate and the best choice for himself, and thus the
POI,
state
sir.
hold on a moment, sir. And thus, the state, since it has a social contract to protect its citizens, it has the obligation to step in and protect the victim. Yes, sir.
Isn't purely by reporting the situation in the first place sending a message that they are not okay with the abuse, whereas on your side they will not report the case even in the first place?
Okay, thank you, sir. So we see that your model is that they will report the case but not prosecute. So what message does it send? This message sends that, oh, so everyone knows that that I abused my wife or my husband, and yet they're not going to do anything about it. Now we see this is even worse than not reporting it at all, because at least even if you don't report it, at least the ones that are reported are prosecuted. But your side is sending the message that what you report, and it doesn't matter, there's no consequences. It's just made known, but no one cares essentially. So we see that your side is as an even worse option. Now they said that the primary stakeholder in this debate is the victim, and the state, and what's good for the general public does not matter at all. However, this is not true. Now we see that what important in justice is also about deterrence. So we see that the state, yes, is obligated to protect individual citizens, but the state is, after all, obligated to protect the public. So we see that it needs to send a very strong message that if you abuse someone, you will be charged, even if you somehow cajole or threaten the person into not prosecuting. The state will still step in and decide, because as I've proven earlier, the victim is simply not fit to make that decision for himself.
POI, sir.
No, sir. Now this actually overturns their first substantive that the victims have a right to privacy, because they simply cannot make this choice. Now the second substantive was that they should focus on healing instead of like just trying to punish the person. However, we see that there's a very simplistic view of this situation. Now we see why do people abuse their partners? We see this because of they're either mentally unstable or they're facing significant stresses and they're unable to manage their emotions. So we see in the real world, the consequences of this is that they tend to go for anger management or counseling, where they are taught, or even in severe cases, medication. So we see this isn't just simply locking them up or other penalties. So we see in the long term, if the victim wants to have a life with a significant other, then allowing the abuser, to go for rehabilitation and allowing him to reintegrate to society is best more easily achievable when the state can step in, because we have to understand that if you just leave it to them, like the abuser will not necessarily just comply and go for treatment. So we see that that we actually win on their own yardstick, that we should that the victim is the most important stakeholder. So now they also mentioned that the state does not know the lives of the victims intimately and thus cannot make a good decision. However, we see that in all crimes, of course, the state does not know the intimate lives of every person and thus cannot and thus we don't see how this is mutually
POI,
exclusive
sir.
to domestic violence. No, sir. So now we see that in any case, as Ray mentioned, the victim simply cannot make a good choice. Even if it's a rational choice, it is simply not a good choice, and they are not able to adequately decide what is best for them. And they also said that why prosecute if there is no benefit to the victim? However, this is simply irrelevant to the debate, right? The debate is about whether the victim can make a right choice. So we see that we see and so we see that you're just side propositions assuming that the prosecution will have no benefit to the victim, which we already explained due to rehabilitation that is simply not true. So the third substantive is the ability to control their own future. So now we really don't see again how this makes sense, because the entire crux of the three substantive is about that the victims knows what is best for them. However, how can we expect someone who has been ridiculed or beaten to make the decision for them? And thus we see that thus to conclude, we see that if the victims cannot make a good decision for themselves, the state has to step in, and thus this motion must fall. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, speaker spoke for 6 minutes and 20 seconds. All right, I'm gonna give you guys, you'll take 2 minutes for the reply. Okay, so if you guys need to consult somehow, I'm not sure how you guys are gonna do that, but you have 2 minutes, and then I'll call opposition up to give their 3-minute reply. Who's giving reply for prop? Okay. Okay, guys. So I'd like to call the opposition team to come up and give their 3-minute reply. 1 second. Okay, so we're gonna get to right to 6 o'clock. So maybe not a lot of feedback, but your coaches will give it to you. Okay, so reply speaker whenever you're ready.
Sorry, just interrupt for a while, but I think our coach actually said that we could just get feedback from you, I think.
Yeah, he said that you need to be, listen, let's give our reply and see how much time we have left. I'm happy to do that, but I know you guys have to leave at 6, okay?
All right, sure, thanks.
All right, whenever you're ready. Who's your reply speaker?
Actually, I think it's fine if we stay past 6 for a while.
Okay. Okay, can we get your reply speaker?
Yeah.
All right,
Yeah, sorry, just setting up my timer.
okay.
two major clashes for the House today. Firstly, on the state versus the victim, and secondly, whether victims make the best decisions. So first, on state versus victims. Proposition brought to us this idea about how victims are the most important ones. And yes, we agree that they're important, but however, proposition did not consider the world in which we live in. We live in a world where justice and law and order is needed. And we told you down the line that it's very important for the state to be able to make a say. We told you in our first, second, and third speaker that deterrence is a very important aspect of the justice system. And we don't want any more domestic violence cases to be coming out, and we don't want any more people to be affected. So what was their response? The response was that victims should be considered. They did not give a very direct reply, and therefore we already win on this case because we're able to better society, we're able to protect future people, and we take this first clash. Secondly, on their second clash, they gave us this point about how victims, okay, so the second clash is about whether victims are able to make this decision. We told you down the line that victims suffer from a lot of emotional trauma. They suffer from, this emotional trauma makes them unable to make proper decisions. And even when given the time span, they are unable to make this decision because of how deeply ingrained the psychological impacts are. And the trauma is, as we've told you down the line, not much response from their side. And they also told us that, they also gave to us this whole idea about how even if, so we also brought to you this idea about how even if these decisions that are made are rational, it's still a bad decision because of how short-sighted and how it's not good for victims in the long run. We told them that, we told you that even if they do make a rational, even if they are in a rational state of mind, these are not good decisions because of how it harms them in the long run, of how it is unable to better their lives and better other people's lives. And for all these reasons and more, side with opposition.
Okay, thank you. Reply speech was 2 minutes and 30 seconds. All right, thank you for that. Okay, Kyra, are you ready? Okay, 3-minute reply if you can make it.
Okay. Now in my speech, I'm going to address 3 clashes. So the first one is who can make the better choice in this situation, the victim or the state? Now, as we've already said in our characterization, the domestic abuse is a personal crime. It is a crime involving an intimate household. It's against the victim and the abuser. It does not affect society as a whole in an individual crime. Side opposition is suggesting that the state get involved in things that are so personal to a specific individual is outrageous because they do not understand what fully goes on in the situation. We have talked about a spectrum in our debate. We have said that there are cases of one-offs and there are extreme cases. While in our side, in our world, we address the cases of one-offs properly, which they do not like to focus on, because the state's immediate response to deterring domestic abuse defining is to be prosecuting. However, in our world, we allow the victims, which are our most vulnerable stakeholders, to give them the better future. They've also said that the state, victims, while they may make the choice that is best for them, it might not be the best it will not be the best choice. This doesn't make any sense because the victim is the only person who knows what is best for them, and they're the only people who can make that choice. Now on to the second class, which is why side proposition takes this clash. On to the second one, which is why the right choice is necessary. They're saying that the long-term effects of a victim making this choice will not be thought out and will eventually come back and be worse than what would happen if the state intervened. However, again, this doesn't make any sense because one, in our world, we are giving the victims a specific period of time to think through and go through this trauma that they've faced, as well as deciding in the one-off cases what is the best response necessary, and they are given the right to choose between to choose the right future, which is what our burden is, to give the most vulnerable stakeholders a better future. And on to the third clash is they're characterizing reporting as not prosecuting. However, in our world, we are not saying that no one will prosecute. We're saying that we're giving them the option of not going through the trial and being able to take the decision that fully supports themselves, which is why reporting could actually be a better form of deterrence, because we're giving them two options. We're also saying that we do not want to prosecute. We don't want to prosecute, but we also are giving you the choice to choose what's right for you, and that's why I'm proud to propose.
Okay. All right. Really good job, guys. Okay. We have a couple minutes left, so let's try to do a little bit of feedback. Then obviously it'll go into a little deeper feedback because I'll rewatch the video for me, and I know Coach Sam's going to watch the video for you guys. Okay. Let's do this.
Should I stop recording now?
Sure. Yeah, that would be.